Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. From your morning coffee to the apps on your phone, there's a huge movement brewing in the American workplace. I'm talking about labor unions. Today, we're going to dive deep into what they are, how they actually work, and why it seems like they're suddenly making a big comeback. So, what do these folks have in common? Well, you've probably seen it in the headlines, right? It's that workers in all of these jobs are part of this growing wave of unionization. We're seeing it at places like Starbucks, Amazon warehouses, and even in the high-tech world of video games. So, what's really driving all this? What's the core issue at play here?
It all comes down to a tension that's basically as old as the idea of having a job. It's this fundamental conflict between the goals of the people doing the work and, well, the goals of the people running the company.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. Look, management has one set of goals, right? It's all about the bottom line, making more money, spending less, and being able to change things up on the fly. Labor, on the other hand, they're focused on the people, better pay, safer conditions, and maybe having a little say in their own future. Now, it's not that one side is good and the other is bad, it's just that their goals, they don't always line up. And this whole dance, this entire push and pull system, has a name. Labor relations. You can think of it as the official rulebook for how employees, unions, and management are all supposed to interact. It's about taking that natural conflict we just talked about and channeling it into a structured process.
Okay, so let's say you're a worker and you decide, hey, we need a union here. How does that actually happen? Well, it's not as easy as just shouting, we're a union now. Nope. There is a formal, legal process you have to follow, an official playbook. And it's all laid out in federal law.
The foundation for that whole playbook is the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA. This was passed way back during the Great Depression, and it was an absolute game changer. For the first time, it gave most workers in the private sector the legally protected right to team up and negotiate with their employers as a group. So, how does it work on the ground? It really boils down to 4 key steps. First, you've got to get your coworkers on board. Then, you need to get at least 30% of them to sign these things called authorization cards. Once you hit that number, you file a petition with a federal agency. And that triggers the final, biggest step, a secret ballot election. If more than half the people vote yes, boom, you've officially got a union. And that federal agency I mentioned, that's the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB. Think of them as the referee in this whole game. It's their job to run the election and make sure both sides are playing by the rules. And believe me, there are rules, especially for what employers can't do. They can't engage in what are called unfair labor practices. That means no threatening to fire people for supporting the union, no spying on organizers, and no suddenly offering everybody a huge raise just to make them vote no. The whole idea is that workers get to make this choice without fear or intimidation. But look, this is not a one-way street. The rulebook applies to unions, too. A law called the Taft-Hartley Act set up unfair practices for unions as well. So they can't threaten workers who don't want to join, and they can't physically block people from getting into work during a strike. The law is really designed to be a two-way street. So imagine the union wins the election. That's a huge moment, a massive victory. But the work is far from over. In fact, you could argue the hardest part is just beginning. Now they have to negotiate that all-important first contract. This right here is the heart and soul of what a union does, collective bargaining. You get people representing labor and people representing management. They sit across the table and they hammer out a legally binding contract that's going to dictate the rules of the road for everyone. And these negotiations cover a ton of ground. It is not just about wages. A union contract gets into the nitty-gritty of everything: job security, health insurance, retirement, work rules, shift schedules, and, this is a huge one, a formal process for what to do when people disagree. But what happens when the two sides just can't agree, when they're at a total impasse? Well, that's when you see the ultimate power plays come out: strikes and lockouts. A strike is when the workers walk off the job to put pressure on the company. A lockout is the opposite. The company locks the doors to put pressure on the workers. Both are a kind of economic warfare designed to force the other side to blink first. Once that contract is finally signed, the entire dynamic of the workplace shifts. Decisions that might have been totally up to a manager's whim before, things like scheduling or promotions or discipline, are now all governed by a clear set of rules that both sides have agreed to live by. So what happens when a worker feels like the company isn't holding up its end of the deal? That's where the grievance procedure comes in. It is a formal, step-by-step process for resolving disputes, and it is honestly one of the most powerful tools a union gives its members. This creates a really clear escalating path to get things solved. It starts simple. An employee and their union rep just go talk to the supervisor. If that doesn't work, okay, it gets put into a formal written complaint. Then it can be appealed up the chain of command. And if there's still no solution, it goes to a neutral third-party arbitrator who makes a final binding decision. It basically replaces arguments with a process.
All right, so we've been deep in the weeds on the nuts and bolts of how unions work. Now let's zoom out and look at the big picture. What's the actual state of the American labor movement today, and where is it all headed?
And this graph, wow, it tells a heck of a story. Back in the 1950s, unions were at their absolute peak. More than a third of all workers were in one. But since then, just look at that line. It's been a steady, decades-long decline, especially in the private sector. Now, public sector unions have held more stable, but the overall picture is clear. Unions are not the force they once were. So the obvious question is, why? What happened? How did union power and influence fall so dramatically? Well, it wasn't just one single thing. It was more like a perfect storm of economic and social shifts.
There are a few key factors. First, the economy itself changed. We moved from union-heavy factory jobs to a service economy that was largely non-union. Second, companies got much more sophisticated and strategic in their efforts to oppose unions. Third, a lot of firms started using HR practices that gave workers some of the same benefits a union would, which made a union feel less necessary. And finally, the government itself stepped in with more regulations, providing protections that workers used to have to fight for in a contract.
And that brings us right back to today. Because despite that long decline, we're seeing this new energy, this new wave of organizing in all these unexpected places. It feels like the old playbook is being tossed out, and as this quote points out, both workers and managers are having to figure out the new rules of the game in real time. And that leaves us with a big question for the future, doesn't it? In this new world of AI, remote work, and the gig economy, what does that relationship between an employer and an employee even look like? The one thing we know for sure is that it's changing fast, and the story of labor in America is far from over. Thanks for joining us.